The moment Zora held her child in her arms, all the pain, fear, and uncertainty of the past months seemed to fade away. The room was quiet except for the soft sounds of her baby's breathing. It was a small, perfect child. Her child, a symbol of everything she had fought for, everything she had hoped for, and everything she had believed was impossible. Marcus stood beside her, his eyes wide with awe, as he watched her gently rock the baby in her arms. It was hard to believe that just a few months ago they had started this journey together, unsure of what the future would hold. Now, here they were with a new life, a new beginning. Zara looked up at Marcus, her face filled with joy. "We did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We really did it." Marcus smiled softly, his heart swelling with pride. "You did it, Zora. You were always strong enough. You just had to believe it." Zora's eyes filled with tears. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that this moment, was the beginning of something incredible. She had been given a second chance, not only to become a mother, but to reshape her life, to shape her future and the future of her kingdom. The news of Zora's child spread quickly throughout the palace, and soon the people of Siloria would know. The royal court, once so resistant to the idea of combining human and alien DNA, would have to face the truth. Zora knew they might never fully accept her choices, but it didn't matter. This child was hers, and Marcus's, and that was all that mattered. The birth of her baby marked the beginning of a new era, not just for Zora, but for Siloria. People began to see the hope that had been born along with the child, a hope that transcended the boundaries of biology and tradition. The kingdom had suffered under the weight of infertility for so long, and now, with the birth of Zora's child, the impossible had been made possible. Zora looked down at her baby, a soft smile on her lips. "You're going to change the world," she whispered. "You're going to show everyone that miracles are real." As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Zora and Marcus raised their child together. They watched as their little one grew, with each day bringing new milestones. First words, first steps, first smiles. The joy that filled their home was beyond anything Zora had ever imagined. She had a family, a purpose, and the love she had always craved. Zora knew the journey wasn't over. There would still be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and fear, but she was no longer afraid. She had found something that would guide her through everything. Love. The love she shared with Marcus. The love she felt for her child. And the love that had healed the wounds she had carried for so long. Standing at the window one evening, looking out over the kingdom, Zara felt a deep sense of peace. The stars above were as bright as ever, but now she saw them with new eyes. This was only the beginning. And whatever the future held, Zara was ready to face it, with her family by her side. Ethan sat in the quiet corner of the starship Serenity, his eyes lazily watching the stars through the massive windows. His work as an engineer didn't often require him to interact with passengers, and that suited him just fine. He was used to the quiet routine of space travel, long hours of fixing things, running diagnostics, and keeping everything running smoothly. The Serenity was a luxury ship, carrying important dignitaries, wealthy traders, and occasionally someone with an interesting background. But to Ethan, they were just people, and he didn't care much for their stories. This trip was supposed to be no different. The Serenity was on a 3-week journey to the neighboring planet, Galacta 7. Ethan had been on the ship dozens of times, always working in the background while the rich and powerful lived in the spotlight. He was happy that way, no need for fame or attention. All he cared about was keeping the ship's systems in top condition. The ship was massive, and the hum of its engines had become a familiar sound in his ears. It was like a second home to him, despite its cold, sterile environment. He passed through the long corridors, checking each panel, making sure everything was functioning properly. Most of the crew was busy with their own tasks, so Ethan didn't have much interaction with anyone outside of his work. But as he walked past the dining hall one evening, something caught his eye. There was a soft murmur of voices, and the usual chatter seemed to stop for a moment. He didn't think much of it at first, but as he continued down the hall, a figure in the distance caught his attention. She was standing near the window, her back turned toward him. Her long, flowing hair shimmered in the dim light of the corridor. She had an air of quiet elegance about her, unlike anyone Ethan had ever seen. People were moving around her, but no one dared to approach. She stood out in a way that Ethan couldn't quite explain. He kept walking, but his curiosity tugged at him. Who was she? It was rare to see someone with such a presence on board, especially someone so different. He didn't have time to think about it further. His work was calling him, and there was no room for distractions. But as he passed, he caught the faintest hint of her perfume, something floral and light, like the scent of a far-off planet. He blinked and continued walking, trying to shake the thought from his mind. As he entered the engine room, Ethan thought about how little he knew about the passengers on the ship. There were so many people on board, but most of them kept to themselves. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this particular woman was different. There was something about her that didn't seem quite right for this kind of journey. For the rest of the day, Ethan worked in silence, the hum of the engines filling his ears. But his mind kept drifting back to her, this mysterious, elegant woman who had caught his eye. Little did he know, his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. Ethan had never been one to focus on appearances. He spent most of his time with his tools, fixing things, and making sure everything on the Serenity ran smoothly. But the moment he saw her again, he couldn't help but notice how different she seemed from anyone else aboard the ship. It was the next day when he accidentally found himself in a part of the ship he wasn't supposed to be. He had been assigned to check the lower decks for any technical issues, and as usual, his mind was fully focused on his work. He moved quickly through the narrow hallways, his boots making soft thuds on the metal floors. As he rounded a corner, he nearly bumped into a tall, thin man in a sharp suit. The man gave him a cold stare but didn't say anything. Ethan was about to apologize when he noticed the group standing just ahead of him, an unexpected gathering. There at the center stood the woman he had seen before. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her back in soft waves, and she wore a dress that seemed to shimmer with the light. She was speaking quietly to a few people, but the moment Ethan stepped into view, she looked up. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. Her gaze was calm but intense, as if she could see straight through him. Ethan quickly looked away, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never felt so out of place before. But then something unexpected happened. She smiled, gently, as though she had recognized him. It wasn't the kind of smile someone gives out of politeness. It was more of a quiet understanding, as if they had shared some unspoken connection. Ethan froze. He hadn't expected her to acknowledge him at all. Most passengers on the ship didn't even give him a second glance. He was just another crew member, another face in the background. But she had looked at him as if she saw something more. The moment was short, but it lingered in his mind long after it had passed. He could feel his heart racing. He had never been good with women, especially women like her. She wasn't just beautiful. She had a presence that made everyone around her stop and take notice. It wasn't just her appearance. It was something in the way she held herself, the quiet confidence that radiated from her every movement. Ethan told himself it didn't matter. He had a job to do, and he couldn't afford to get distracted. He turned to leave, but as he did, he heard her soft voice. "Excuse me," she said. Ethan stopped, turning back to face her. She was walking toward him now, her steps graceful and deliberate. The people around her had already started to move away, as if they knew it was her time to leave. "Are you the one in charge of the ship's systems?" she asked, her voice calm and soothing. Ethan nodded, a little taken aback by the directness of her question. "Yes, I'm an engineer. Is there something wrong?" She smiled again, this time more playfully. "No, nothing wrong. But I've heard good things about your work." Ethan felt his cheeks flush. He didn't know what to say. He had never been good at talking to people like her, but she didn't seem to mind. "I'm Princess Zyra," she said, extending a hand to him. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had heard of her. Princess Zyra, the heir to the Velmar Empire. He had no idea she was on this ship. "Ethan," he managed to say, shaking her hand awkwardly. For a moment, neither of them spoke, but in the quiet, Ethan couldn't help but feel like his life had just shifted in a way he couldn't explain. Over the next few days, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about Princess Zyra. Every time their paths crossed, his heart would race, and he'd feel that familiar awkwardness. But it wasn't just her beauty that caught his attention. It was her kindness, the way she always seemed to make him feel at ease, even when he was nervous. It started with small encounters. One morning, while Ethan was working on a routine check in the observation lounge, he found himself once again near her. This time, she was sitting by the large windows, staring out at the stars, her profile illuminated by the soft light of the galaxy beyond. She didn't notice him at first, and Ethan took a deep breath, telling himself he wouldn't disturb her. But something about her presence made him feel like he should. As if she sensed him standing there, Zyra looked up. Her eyes met his, and she smiled, the same gentle, knowing smile he had seen before. Ethan felt a flush rise to his cheeks, but he couldn't look away. "You're always around when I least expected," she said, her voice warm and inviting. Ethan wasn't sure what to say. He hadn't expected to run into her here, and he definitely hadn't expected her to speak to him again. Just checking the systems," he stammered. "I didn't mean to intrude." Zyra laughed softly, a sound that seemed to fill the room with warmth. "You're not intruding. It's a big ship, and it's nice to see a familiar face every now and then." Her words were simple, but there was something in the way she said them that made Ethan feel like he was the most important person in the room. He couldn't understand it, but he liked it. He felt a strange sense of comfort in her presence. "Would you like to sit?" she asked, patting the seat next to hers. Ethan hesitated for a moment, but then, for some reason, he decided to take a chance. He walked over and sat down beside her. They both turned their attention to the stars outside, and for a long while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt natural, not awkward at all. After a few moments, Zyra spoke again. "You know, it's rare to meet someone on this ship who isn't trying to impress everyone around them." Ethan turned to look at her. "Impress them?" he asked, confused. "Yes," she said. "Everyone on this ship is so focused on status, on power, on how others perceive them. It's exhausting." Ethan nodded. He could see that. In his line of work, he'd seen enough to know that many passengers on the Serenity were more interested in showing off than in having real conversations. But Zyra wasn't like that. She didn't care about status or appearance. It was refreshing. "I can't imagine living that way," Ethan said, leaning back in his chair. "But I guess you don't really have a choice." Zyra looked out the window, her expression becoming distant for a moment. "Sometimes it feels like I don't. Being a princess, there are expectations, responsibilities." She paused, then turned to him. "But I'm more than just that. I'm human, too." Her words struck Ethan deeply. He hadn't thought about the pressures she must face. To him, she had always seemed perfect, but now he saw her in a new light. She was just like anyone else, struggling with her own challenges. As the conversation continued, Ethan found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. He shared stories about his life, about how he became an engineer and how he loved fixing things. Zyra listened intently, her gaze never leaving him. In turn, she shared more about her life as a princess, the duties she had to uphold, and the constant pressure to be perfect. The more they talked, the more Ethan realized that there was so much more to her than the royal title. She was a person, just like him, with dreams, fears, and hopes for the future. As the conversation came to an end, Zyra smiled at him again. "It's nice to talk to someone who doesn't expect anything from me. You make it easy to just be." Ethan smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through him. I'm just glad I could listen. The Serenity was a ship known for its extravagance, and nothing demonstrated that better than the grand gala it hosted every year. It was an event attended by the wealthiest and most powerful beings in the galaxy, and tonight it was no different. Ethan had no interest in attending, of course. He was an engineer, not someone who belonged among the shiny, polished crowd of elites. But his supervisor had insisted, saying it would be good for him to network and perhaps learn something new. Ethan reluctantly put on the formal attire he had been given, feeling awkward in the tailored suit. He never felt at ease in places like these. Too much chatter, too many people pretending to be something they weren't. As he walked through the grand hall toward the dining area, his eyes scanned the crowd. Everyone was dressed in expensive, glittering gowns and sharp suits, speaking in hushed tones, their faces glowing with self-importance. But then he saw her. Zira stood at the center of a group of admirers, her presence impossible to ignore. The soft, radiant glow of the chandelier lights seemed to highlight her beauty even more. She wore a gown of deep blue, the fabric flowing around her like liquid stars. Her dark hair cascaded down her back, and her calm, composed expression made her look like she belonged to a world far beyond this ship. For a moment, Ethan stopped in his tracks. He hadn't realized how much he'd been thinking about her until now. Her presence always seemed to draw his attention, and yet it was never in an overwhelming way. She had a quiet grace that was impossible to ignore. As he stood there, trying to figure out what to do next, their eyes met. For a brief second, time seemed to stand still. There were no crowded conversations, no loud music from the orchestra, just Ethan and Zira, locked in an unspoken connection. Then, as if sensing his hesitation, she smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made his heart skip a beat. She excused herself from the group of people she had been speaking with and started walking toward him. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. He hadn't expected this, hadn't imagined that she might notice him in a place like this. Yet here she was, coming toward him as though she had been waiting for this moment. Ethan, she greeted him warmly, her voice cutting through his nervousness. I didn't expect to see you here. I wasn't planning to come, Ethan admitted, trying to sound more confident than he felt. But my supervisor insisted. Zira laughed softly, the sound like music. Well, I'm glad you did. You should join me for a drink. Ethan hesitated, unsure of what to do. He was a simple engineer, and here he was, standing in front of the most beautiful and powerful person on the ship. He never imagined he'd be standing in the same circle, let alone sharing a drink with her. Are you sure? He asked, glancing at the crowd around them. I'm sure, she said with a warm smile. You seem more at ease here than most of these people. Ethan chuckled nervously. I'm not sure that's a compliment. She raised an eyebrow playfully. It's a compliment if you take it the right way. With a mix of excitement and nervousness, Ethan followed her to the bar. For the first time since boarding the Serenity, he felt a little more at ease in his surroundings. Talking to Zira was somehow easier than he had imagined. It wasn't about her status or the expectations that came with it. It was just the two of them, sharing a moment in a crowded room that suddenly didn't feel so crowded at all. As they stood there, talking about everything and nothing, Ethan realized that Zira wasn't just a princess. She was someone who saw him, not as a crew member, but as a person. And for once, Ethan wasn't worried about fitting in. All that mattered was the conversation they were having and the connection they were building. After the gala, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between him and Zira. The night had been full of formalities and pleasant conversations with strangers, but the moments he spent with her were the only ones that felt real. There was a calmness to her, something that made him feel like he could relax and be himself, even in the midst of the overwhelming event. The following day, he found himself working late in the ship's engine room, making sure everything was running smoothly for their next destination. The Serenity was a massive ship, and there was always something that needed fixing. As he worked, he was so focused on his task that he didn't notice someone approaching until a soft voice spoke from behind him. "Ethan." He turned to see Zira standing in the doorway, her dark eyes watching him with a curious expression. She looked out of place in the utilitarian surroundings of the engine room, her elegant dress replaced with something more comfortable, a simple tunic and pants. But even in such simple clothing, she exuded grace and beauty. "Princess Zira," Ethan said, standing up quickly, surprised to see her. "What are you doing down here?" Zira smiled and stepped inside. "I was hoping to find you. I know it's unusual for a princess to visit the engine room, but I wanted to talk to you." Ethan felt a bit uncomfortable, but he quickly hid it. He didn't want to seem like he was out of his depth. "Of course," he said, trying to sound casual. "What did you want to talk about?" Zira's expression softened. "I've been thinking about our conversation at the gala. You're one of the few people who hasn't treated me like a princess. You see me as someone else, and I appreciate that." Ethan wasn't sure what to say. He had never thought of her as anything other than a person. Her title, her royal status, none of that mattered to him. She was just someone who had shown kindness and warmth when everyone else around her seemed to care only about power or status. "I don't see you as anything other than who you are," Ethan replied. "I'm just not used to being around people who expect things from you. You seem different, real." Zira's eyes softened as she walked closer to him. "That's exactly it, isn't it? I spent my whole life being the princess, the heir to the throne. People expect me to be perfect, to have it all together. But what they don't understand is that I'm just like anyone else. I have fears, doubts, and dreams." Ethan looked at her, his heart unexpectedly pulling at him. "What kind of dreams?" Zira paused for a moment, her gaze drifting to the ship's engine systems, the humming noise filling the quiet room. "I dream of being free. Free to choose my path, to be with people who see me for who I truly am, not just as a title. But that's something I can never have. The pressure of being royal, it's suffocating." Ethan could feel the weight of her words, and for the first time, he saw the vulnerability in her eyes. She wasn't the perfect, untouchable princess he had imagined her to be. She was someone struggling to break free from a life of expectation. He didn't know what to say to make her feel better, but he knew one thing. "You're not alone," he said quietly. "You don't have to go through this alone." Zira smiled softly, the tension in her shoulders easing a little. "Thank you, Ethan. You have no idea how much it means to hear that." They stood there in silence for a few moments, the sound of the ship's systems the only noise between them. Ethan wasn't sure what would happen next, but in that moment, he realized that his life had changed. It wasn't just the ship or the mission that mattered anymore. It was her. Over the next few days, Ethan found himself spending more time with Zira. What had started as a few chance encounters now felt like something more meaningful. She was no longer just the princess, the distant royal figure. She was someone he could talk to, someone who made him feel seen. And in return, he found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't with anyone else. They met regularly in quiet corners of the ship, away from the busy crew and the formalities of royal duties. Sometimes they would talk about the ship, the endless stars outside, and their shared experience of being away from home. Other times, their conversations turned more personal, as if they both needed someone to listen, to understand. Zira had confided in him about the heavy weight of her responsibilities as the future queen of the Velmar Empire. She spoke of the political pressure, the endless expectations placed on her, and the feeling that she was being pulled in every direction. It was clear that, despite her grace and elegance, the role she was born into had its burdens. She longed for freedom, for a life without constant scrutiny. Ethan understood that feeling in a way. His life was simple. He worked on the ship, fixed things, and stayed out of the spotlight. But he had always felt like there was more to his life than just fixing engines and keeping things running. Talking to Zira made him realize that everyone, no matter their position, had dreams and struggles. She wasn't just the princess. She was a person who longed for peace and happiness, just like anyone else. But what surprised Ethan the most was how comfortable he felt around her. She made him laugh, made him feel at ease in a way no one else had. Despite the vast differences in their lives, there was an undeniable connection between them, a bond that had formed without either of them really trying. One evening after a long day of work, Ethan was walking through the ship's promenade when he saw Zira sitting alone by a window, staring out at the stars. The way the soft light from the windows illuminated her face made her look like she belonged in another world. She was so beautiful, so serene, yet there was a sadness in her eyes that made Ethan's heart ache. He hesitated for a moment before walking over and sitting beside her. She didn't look up at first, but when she sensed his presence, she turned to him and smiled. "You're always finding me in the quietest places," she said, her voice light and teasing. Ethan smiled back, though there was a touch of nervousness in his expression. "I guess I just like the quiet too. And I wanted to see you." Zira raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, and why's that?" "I don't know," Ethan said, shrugging. "I guess I feel like when I'm with you, everything else fades away. It's nice." Her expression softened, and for a moment, they just sat there in silence, watching the stars together. Ethan could sense the unspoken words between them, the growing closeness that neither of them wanted to acknowledge. It was clear to Ethan that his feelings for Zira had changed. It wasn't just admiration anymore. There was something deeper there, something that, for the first time, he didn't want to ignore. The calm that had settled between Ethan and Zira was suddenly shattered when a new piece of information reached them. There had been whispers among the crew, low voices speaking of a danger lurking in the shadows. At first, neither Ethan nor Zira took the rumors seriously. But as more details surfaced, they couldn't ignore the growing tension on board the Serenity. Zira had been discreet, asking Ethan if he had noticed anything strange. He hadn't, not at first, but now that he thought about it, there was a certain unease in the air. Crew members were on edge, and even the passengers, usually so absorbed in their luxury, seemed uneasy. People were speaking in hushed tones, avoiding eye contact, as if they were afraid of something or someone. One evening, as they sat in their usual spot in the quiet part of the ship, Zira turned to Ethan with a serious look on her face. "Ethan, there's something I need to tell you." Ethan looked up, immediately sensing the shift in her tone. "What's wrong?" Zira's gaze hardened. "There's a plot against me. Someone wants to see me dead." Ethan felt his stomach drop. "What? Who would want that?" She took a deep breath, clearly trying to keep her composure. "There are enemies of the Velnar Empire on board. A rival faction, hoping to destabilize the throne. They've put a bounty on my life." Ethan didn't know what to say. He had never imagined something so dangerous could be happening right under their noses. "What do we do?" Zira met his eyes, determination flashing in hers. "We have to find out who's behind it before it's too late. I can't leave it to the authorities. They might be compromised. But I trust you, Ethan. You've been the only one who hasn't treated me like a princess, who hasn't tried to use me for your own gain." Ethan felt a rush of pride at her words, but also fear. The reality of the situation was sinking in. He wasn't a soldier, and he had no idea how to protect someone as important as Zira. But her trust in him gave him the courage he needed. He wasn't about to let anything happen to her. "I'll help you," he said, his voice steady despite the growing panic inside him. "We'll figure this out. We'll find out who's behind this." Zira smiled faintly, her eyes softening. "Thank you, Ethan. I don't know what I would do without you." They spent the next few hours discussing their plan, moving carefully through the ship's corridors, keeping their voices low so no one could overhear. They knew they had to be cautious. If someone on the ship had it out for Zira, they couldn't risk drawing attention to themselves. Every move had to be calculated. The weight of the situation hung heavy between them. But in that moment, Ethan knew that his feelings for Zira had grown even stronger. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She was someone he cared about deeply, and he wasn't going to let anything happen to her, no matter what. The days following the revelation of the threat against Zira were filled with tension. Every step they took was more cautious than the last, and every conversation was carefully planned. Ethan and Zira knew they couldn't waste time. The conspiracy was real, and they had to uncover the people behind it before it was too late. They decided to work together, using their different skills to gather information without drawing attention. Zira's royal status gave her access to parts of the ship that Ethan couldn't reach, while Ethan's knowledge of the ship's inner workings allowed him to find hidden places where secrets could be kept. One evening, after a long day of carefully observing the ship's crew and passengers, they met in one of the quiet lounges. The weight of the situation was starting to show on both of them. Zira, usually so composed, was starting to look exhausted, and Ethan could feel the pressure mounting. But they couldn't afford to slow down now. "Do you think we're getting closer?" Ethan asked, his voice low as he sat across from Zira. She looked at him, her face serious, her eyes reflecting the same worry that had been growing in him. "I hope so," she replied. "But every time we find a clue, it seems like we're just one step behind. Whoever is behind this knows how to cover their tracks." Ethan sighed. It felt like they were running out of time. But despite the fear that was growing inside him, he knew they had to keep going. Zira had trusted him, and he wasn't about to let her down. "I've been thinking," he said, leaning forward. "If someone is trying to kill you, they're going to try to do it somewhere people won't notice, right? So we need to look at places where people wouldn't expect us to be." Zira's eyes brightened, and she nodded. "That makes sense. The more public spaces are too risky. But there are areas on the ship where I don't have the usual guards. It might be worth checking those places." Ethan agreed. "We'll need to be careful. If we're seen snooping around, it could make things worse." Zira stood up, her posture shifting from one of fatigue to one of determination. "We've already come this far. We can't stop now." For the next few days, they continued their quiet investigation. They moved through the ship like shadows, avoiding the eyes of the crew and passengers. They searched empty rooms, secret hallways, and unnoticed corners of the Serenity. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary. One night, while inspecting a little-used storage room near the ship's cargo bay, they stumbled across something unexpected: a hidden compartment that had been recently disturbed. Ethan's heart raced as he knelt down to examine the area more closely. Inside, they found a small encrypted device, a communication tool most likely used to send secret messages. "This could be it," Ethan whispered, his fingers trembling as he picked it up. "We need to get this to a secure terminal and decrypt it." Zira nodded, her expression more focused than ever. "Let's move quickly." They carefully made their way to a secure area of the ship where they could safely analyze the device. As they worked together, their quiet teamwork began to feel more natural, more comfortable. But underneath the tension and the fear of what they might discover, Ethan couldn't ignore the growing bond between them. No matter how dangerous this mission became, no matter what secrets they uncovered, Ethan knew one thing for sure: he would do whatever it took to protect Zira. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She was someone he cared about deeply. The moment they decrypted the message from the hidden device, everything changed. The contents were clear, and the danger was far worse than either of them had imagined. The message was from a high-ranking officer aboard the ship, someone with close access to both the crew and the passengers. It confirmed that Zira was the target of a well-coordinated plot to assassinate her and destabilize the Velnar Empire. Ethan and Zira exchanged worried glances as they read through the message. The officer had been working with a rival faction, and it seemed they had already planned the attack. It was supposed to happen soon, within the next 24 hours. Their time was running out. "What do we do now?" Ethan asked, his voice tense. Zira looked at him, her expression grim. "We have to confront him before it's too late. We can't let him continue this plan. But we can't do it alone." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of her words. They needed help, but they couldn't trust anyone on the ship. Not after discovering that someone close to them had been working against Zira. Their only option was to face the enemy head-on. That night, after dark, they made their way to the ship's command center, where they suspected the officer was stationed. It was a risky move. They knew that if they were caught, it could mean disaster for both of them. But Zira was determined, and Ethan wasn't going to leave her side. The hallways were quiet as they moved through the ship. It felt like the ship was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Ethan's heart was pounding, and his thoughts raced as they approached the command center. "We have to be careful," Zira whispered. "We don't know how many people are involved in this." Ethan nodded. "I'll stay close. We'll handle this together." They reached the door to the command center, and Zira hesitated for a moment. She was a princess, and in many ways, she was used to being in control. But now, she wasn't sure what would happen once they confronted the officer. "You're sure about this?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Zira met his gaze, her eyes filled with determination. "I have no choice. This is the only way." With a steady hand, Zira opened the door to the command center. The officer was sitting at a desk, his back to them. He didn't notice them at first, but as they stepped inside, he froze. He turned slowly, his face betraying nothing, but his eyes gave him away. He knew exactly who they were. "You shouldn't have come here, Princess," the officer said coolly, standing up from his chair. Ethan stepped forward, his body tense. "It's over. We know what you've been planning." The officer smirked. "You think you can stop it? You're just a crew member. A nobody." Zira took a step forward, her voice cold. "I may be a princess, but I'm not helpless, and neither is Ethan. We're not going to let you destroy everything we've worked for." The officer's expression changed for a moment, but then he laughed. "You're brave. I'll give you that. But you're out of time." Before either of them could react, the officer pressed a button on his console. The lights in the room flickered, and alarms blared through the ship. Ethan's heart raced as he realized what had happened. The officer had triggered a lockdown. "We have to stop him before he sends out a distress signal," Ethan said urgently. "Zira, let's move." But the officer was already moving too. He reached for a hidden weapon at his side, and in that moment, everything was at risk. The sound of the alarms echoed in the ship's halls, the flashing red lights casting an eerie glow on the walls. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he and Zira moved quickly through the command center. The officer had drawn his weapon, but neither of them had the time to waste. They needed to stop him before he could send the distress signal. Ethan lunged toward the officer, grabbing his arm just as the weapon was aimed in their direction. The officer struggled, but Ethan was strong, fueled by the urgency of the situation. "Zira, get the control panel," he shouted. Zira didn't hesitate. She moved swiftly to the console, her fingers flying over the buttons as she tried to override the lockdown and stop the emergency transmission. "Hurry," she said, her voice tight with tension. The officer, realizing he was losing control, tried to pull away from Ethan, but the engineer's grip was firm. With a final twist, Ethan knocked the weapon from the officer's hand. The officer stumbled back, now unarmed, his face twisted in rage. "You'll never win," the officer spat. "Even if you stop me, there are others. The plan is already in motion." Zira paused for a moment, her eyes locking onto the officer. "It's over," she said, her voice steady. "We've exposed your plot. It ends here." With one final push, Zira managed to disable the system. The alarms stopped blaring, and the red lights flickered back to normal. The lockdown was lifted. The danger was over. But the victory felt bittersweet. The officer was subdued, but the realization of what they had just prevented was heavy. Zira turned to Ethan, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You did it," she said quietly, her voice full of emotion. Ethan smiled, though his heart was still racing. "We did it. Together." Zira stepped closer to him, her gaze softening. I couldn't have done this without you. You've been my strength through all of this, and I'm grateful." Ethan's chest tightened as he looked at her. It was clear now. His feelings for Zira were stronger than he had ever realized. She wasn't just a princess or someone he admired from a distance. She was someone he cared for deeply, someone he would protect at any cost. But Zira was still bound by her royal duties, and Ethan knew that. She was destined to return to her empire, to take her place as queen. Their lives, though connected by these events, were still separated by the vast differences in their worlds. Zira took a deep breath, as if she was considering something important. "Ethan," she began, "I know my responsibilities as a princess and heir to the throne. But these last few days, I've realized that I don't want to live a life where I'm just a symbol, a title. I want to live a life that matters." Ethan nodded, his heart heavy. He had always known that her future was set in stone, but hearing her speak so openly about it made him realize just how much they had shared in such a short time. Zira smiled softly, a sad but hopeful look in her eyes. "I don't know what the future holds, but I want you to know, Ethan, that you'll always have a place in my life. No matter where I go or what happens, you'll always be someone I'll remember." Ethan felt a pang in his chest, but he smiled back. "And you'll always have a place in mine." As the ship continued its journey through the stars, both of them knew that the adventure they had shared would never be forgotten. And though their paths might lead them in different directions, they had formed a bond that nothing could break.